Chapter 46. Luli. Layla could not stop staring at the stretch of sparkling, flowing sand. This was her first time seeing the sand sea up close. It took her breath away. Majestic, isn't it? She whirled to see her mother riding beside her on one of the tribe's camels. Layla glanced back at the shifting gold-red tides. It looks like the ocean. Some people said the sea was infinite, that it had no bottom. Was the sand sea the same way? The Jinn live here, her mother said. So far down, only the strongest can climb out. Layla tilted her head. Does that mean if we dove deep enough, we could visit the Jinn's world like they visit ours? Her mother smiled wryly. The Jinn have magic, dearest one. Magic to help them break through a tide of endless sand. We do not have the same power. We would stop breathing before we reached the bottom. Layla startled when her mother set a hand on her shoulder. We are wanderers, but even we must never venture into the sand sea. It is too dangerous. She raised a brow. You hear me, sweet fire? Do not ever walk into the sand sea. Layla turned away to hide her flush. It wasn't that she'd actually been considering it, just that she was curious. She cleared her throat. You told me once the sand sea was made from gin fire. Her mother's gaze turned wistful. The sand sea is a rip in the world, made from a fire so fierce it has never stopped burning. That kind of magic you must stay away from. Do you understand, sweet fire? Luli did not understand. She did not understand why the sand sea had suddenly swallowed the ruins and why it had not yet killed her. Everywhere she looked there was sand, and yet that sand was more of a tunnel than an ocean, a churning eddy of red and gold that spun around her like a tornado. She fell, and it was like falling into the sun. Is this what the sand sea has been all along? A tunnel to the center of the world? But then, finally, the end came. She hit the ground hard enough to have the breath knocked from her lungs. She slowly forced herself to sit up. She spotted the prince first. He was on his knees a few feet away from her, digging the compass out of the sand. She had recovered it in the darkened treasure chamber when Imad threw it away during the scare. She was glad it had made it down here with them. She glanced around, noticing they were surrounded on all sides by walls of falling sand. Then she turned her gaze upward, and beheld the gigantic hole above them. Sand fell from its edges, dusting her lashes. She could just barely make out the crumbling ruins, which meant that they were beneath them now? How was that possible? Midnight merchant? The prince was batting sand from his eyes. She waved him over. The prince rose, glanced up. His mouth fell open. Oh, he said weakly, and then his eyes went wide and he whirled toward her. Aisha. The name was a plea. She swallowed, shook her head. She'd seen Aisha die, just as she'd seen Kadir die. Kadir. She froze. The knife. She looked around for it desperately, but there was only sand. The ground was sand, the walls were sand, and there was nothing else, no one else. No, no, no. She was a damned fool. She had given Aisha the knife, and now it was gone. But no, she had lost Kadir once. She refused to lose him again. Distantly, she heard the prince yelling her name. His voice was laced with panic. She did not understand why until she followed his horrified gaze to the hole. That was when she saw the nameless terror, a shadowy being coated in blue fire, falling through the opening. The thing rushed toward them so suddenly, Luli had no time to react. One moment the world was warm and golden, the next it was hot and red and burning. If falling into the sand sea had been like falling into the sun, this was like walking headfirst into an inferno. The sliver of metal at her throat grew unbearably hot. When she touched the metal she felt fire, fire caressing her skin and warming her palms, fire she recognized. Invisible fingers pressed down on her own. There was a final flare of heat and then freedom. The shackle crumbled to ash and fell from her neck. Luli gasped, looked up, and beheld a wall of flames. The fire faded from blue to gold, to red, to black, and then into the shape of a man. A man so faded he was nearly non-existent. The whorls of his skin ran together like water, and his ruby-red eyes were so bright they were devoid of irises. Familiar, yet unfamiliar. Luli was in too much shock to say his name. The phantom reached down to pick her up. Being held by him was like being held by smoke. There was a soft pressure at her head and a gentle heat soaking her skin. But mostly there was relief, a relief that coursed through her veins and screamed, "Safe." "You." The prince stepped back, clutching the compass. "How?" The fiery apparition ignored him and flicked a wrist at one of the walls of sand. It parted like a curtain, burning away into crackling embers and opening up into a tunnel. The phantom glanced down at her, pressed the blade into her hands. Kadir's knife. The red eyes blinked at her from the surface. "Kadir?" She gripped the blade. He was back. He was back. "Compass," Kadir rasped in a parchment-thin voice. He pointed to the tunnel and looked at Mazen expectantly. The prince stepped back. "How are you here? How are we here? What kind of magic—" The walls of sand shuddered. Luli looked up just in time to see sand come crashing through the hole above them. It was nearly upon them when Kadir lifted his hand and conjured a shield of flame. The sand dissipated into sparks upon impact, but it was coming hard and fast, and the pressure was breaking the shield. "Go!" he roared. The prince bolted toward the tunnel. Kadir followed. He was smoke and wind, and moved so fast Luli felt as if she were flying. He kept one hand outstretched toward the sand, parting it with heat as they ran. Luli heard the hiss of sand as it crashed behind them, filling the tunnel. She pressed her tear-stained face into his shoulder. "I'm here," he said softly. If she concentrated hard enough, she could almost pretend he was not smoke, that he was flesh and blood, and that he was here, truly here. "What a pathetic way to die," she said. "You're not going to die." "The arrow won't stop changing direction," Mazen called up ahead. "We're almost there," Kadir called back, his voice so soft Luli barely heard it over the tumultuous roar of sand behind them. She turned her head and blinked as the light assaulted her senses, as the sand sloped upward toward a hole glowing with sunlight, a hole that led outside. "You see? Almost there." His voice was faint. He was faint. She could barely feel his hands anymore. "Don't leave me." She clung to him fiercely. "You're not allowed to leave me." She could feel the light pressing into her eyes now, could feel the kiss of the wind against her skin as they wove their way through the sinking ruins and ran up a hill of falling sand, climbing higher and higher, until a scream tore through the air. Luli looked up and saw the prince, nothing but a shadow haloed in blinding light. She saw him collapse to his knees and slide down the slope, gripping his arm. She became aware of the second shadow only when the knife whistled past her ear and cut through Kadir's smoky form. The Jinn's arm gave way, and she was suddenly falling, coughing sand as she tumbled down the slope. "You! It was you we were looking for," she recognized Omar's voice. And when she looked up and saw him pointing uphill at Kadir's misty body with madness in his eyes, she recognized that too. She remembered the chains, the collar, the knife against her throat. Not Omar. The laugh that left Imad's throat was a broken thing. "You lied to me, merchant." He hobbled toward her, dragging a clearly broken leg behind him. His skin was marred with odd black splatters that shone like blood. "Your compass is not the relic we were ordered to find. The king's relic we searched for. It didn't exist. And your Jinn," his breathing was a wet rasp, "is more than just a Jinn, isn't he? Luli, look at me." Luli stared at the thief, uncomprehending. "Luli." The dagger in her hand grew hot with fire. She looked down and saw Kadir's narrowed eyes. "Do you still want your vengeance?" His voice echoed in her mind even as his mute, shadowy form slid down the hill toward her. Imad's laughter was so loud and wild it made his body shake. "It's no wonder he lives. Do you know what he is, girl?" "He killed your family," Kadir said. "Everything that's happened, it's his fault," cried Imad. "He destroyed your tribe." The fire glowed with such an intensity it burned dark spots into her vision, and in those patches of darkness she saw the nightmare. Her campsite on fire, her family dead. Midnight Merchant. The title startled her from her memories. She looked up, past Imad and Kadir, and saw the prince. He sat atop the dune, holding his bloody arm and yelling her name. "Luli, Midnight Merchant." She gripped the dagger. She was not Layla. She was not weak. Not anymore. It didn't matter that she couldn't walk. She could crawl. And so she did, clawing her way through the sand until she could slash at Imad's legs. He retaliated by kicking dust into her face. Luli blinked back tears and aimed for his bad leg. She plunged her dagger into his foot. The fire coating the blade was a living thing. It spread up Imad's leg, coating his clothing, and then it began to burn through his skin. Imad stumbled away with a scream, wildly tearing at his attire. Luli reached for his ankle. The fire curved away from her fingers just long enough for her to pull Imad down, for her to pin him to the ground. When he tried to defend himself, she deflected his strike and buried the knife into his chest. Not enough. She stabbed him again. His skin burned. Not enough. Crumbled to charcoal. Not enough. She slashed and stabbed and screamed and sobbed, and it was strange, so strange that no matter how many times she cut him, there was no blood. Just that strange ink that kept seeping out of him. And why won't he bleed? He deserves to bleed. He deserves to hurt. She was sobbing so hard by the end of it that she dropped the dagger. She felt warmth on her back, arms around her shoulders. "Don't look," Kadir whispered as he picked her and the fallen blade up. And she didn't. Not until they mounted the dune and Imad was nothing but a distant blot of ash. Then, sunlight. She had to blink back tears to see, and when she could, she saw Kadir's fading face above her. His red eyes had lightened to their shade of human brown, but they were barely an impression. Luli grabbed at his chest. "Kadir," she said, willing him to solidify with the name. He smiled at her weakly. "You did it. You avenged your family." His smile faded first, followed by the rest of his body. He lowered her to the ground, and as he vanished, as he went from man to smoke to dust, the prince grabbed her before she collapsed, and carefully lowered her to the ground. The two of them sat side by side, watching the ruins sink into the sand sea. The prince grasped his injured arm and prayed. Luli stared resolutely ahead, trying not to cry and failing. She had her vengeance, but it was an empty triumph.